Good morning, everyone, and very much welcome to this special session by Holland Fintech and Bureau Brandeis on the international sanctions that are being imposed currently through the financial industry, in particular to Russia. It's quite a new step in the way that you see financial services are being deployed by governments to play a role in modern warfare, actually, you could argue. And it's posing all kinds of challenges, I think, for the organizations that amongst the ones that we have in our network. But I think for financial services companies across the globe, this is quite challenging. How to do this right, how to support also Ukraine through this, and at the same time also have your operations in order and make sure that you actually comply with the new requirements. Quite a challenging landscape, I think, from that perspective. So we'd like to give you a bit of an update, and I hope to look forward to actually have some discussion about how this could move forward. And next to me here is Simone Peek. Simone, good morning.
Good morning.
Yeah, very
Thanks
nice
for
to see
having
you.
me. Yeah.
Great to have you here in person, right? So we're really keen to actually meet each other again a bit more, not just behind the screen.
Yeah.
Well, Simone will be telling us about the sanctions, where we stand at the moment, and we hope to be able to spark a nice discussion about that. So
Absolutely.
All over to you, Simone.
Yeah, looking forward to it. Thank you. Yeah, so my name is Simone Peek. I'm a lawyer and a partner at Bureau Brandeis. We're a litigation firm here based in Amsterdam, covering all kinds of areas, but my focus is the financial services area, so a lot of financial litigation, dealing a lot with the financial regulators here in the Netherlands and elsewhere. AFM, DNB proceedings, and at the moment we're very much focused on everything that's happening in the world around Ukraine, Russia, sanctions being imposed, and all the challenges that come along with it for us, for you guys, and for everyone to make sense of them and to be able to implement sanctions correctly. I think a very sort of on point and hot topic to discuss today. And let's make it as interactive as possible. If anyone has any questions in the meantime or things come up, do feel free to interrupt or use chat or whatever. Then we can make sure we cover those. And we've got all kinds of topics to discuss. I think when it comes to sanctions, I think I can use the slides, right?
Yeah.
Let's see if that's working. I should be able to. Yeah, good. So I think a lot of familiar faces at the moment. So when we're looking at or discussing international sanctions, we're very much looking at what's happening in the world and the geopolitical landscape. And maybe I think right now, I think we're all very aware of how international sanctions are being used. We just talked about sanctions being maybe a weapon in the crisis that is going on. But it's very much indeed a instrument of foreign policy of the various areas and in the world. I think what we can discuss a lot today. We might not be able to cover everything, but I just wanted to play it by ear also a little bit, but give a little bit of a background on sanctions in general. So where do these come from and how do these play out sort of in the general picture? A little bit to zoom in on sort of the specific sanctions that are now being imposed in terms of Ukraine, Russia, but also Belarus, for example, and how to manage risks in terms of how do we deal with them, what do we need to look at to make sure we have our everything, our clients, our relations screened against sanctions. What can we do in terms of compliance, contractual safeguards, and how to get out of a contract if sanctions are being imposed. So, and at the end, we can discuss some useful tools, but maybe that goes without saying. And do interrupt. So there are various sanctions regimes around the world, but I think When we discuss them, of course, the EU is for us being established here in the Netherlands, in one of the EU countries, most important regime. So sanctions are being imposed not by our Dutch government, but by the European Union, European Council, in EU regulations that are directly applicable in all the member states and in the Netherlands. Yep. So they're the law that we have to abide by. US sanctions come into play. These are very much, when it comes to Ukraine, Russia, very much alike. There are also other sanctions programs in terms of, for example, Cuba or Iran, where there are differences between EU and US. But here they're very much aligned. But it's always good to keep those in mind, and also that there are some differences. We can discuss about those a little bit later on. UN often, not in this case, in the case of Ukraine, Russia, but often the UN starts with a resolution on sanctions that are needed sort of in the world, and then EU and US take those on board. Right now, of course, with Russia being in the Security Council, it's not the UN that is the front runner here, but it's the EU and US themselves. In the Netherlands, we do have a national sort of terrorism list, but that's a very small Dutch edition, I would say.
Okay. Yeah. And so that's pretty much in line with what you would see from the international requirements. Or is there actually an addendum to it from a Dutch perspective?
There's actually an addendum from a Dutch perspective, but currently that list mainly contains, for example, people that have went to the Caliphate a couple of years ago to fight jihad. And
specific Dutch cases.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. A lot of kids on the list, I would say. Yeah.
Okay.
Or young adults. Yeah. And so I briefly touched upon it. The EU sanctions apply, well, to everyone sort of within the EU, businesses that are incorporated here in the EU, and sort of business being done within the EU. So it applies to you and me. Also, we have to, as EU citizens, we have to apply and comply with EU sanctions regulations. But then again, of course, we're in the financial world and the fintech area. The financials are an important gatekeeper when it comes to sanctions compliance.
But so indeed, it's an interesting case, perhaps, right? Because I think we're talking mostly from the financial industry. But I think if you look at, for example, recently someone told me that on Airbnb they got a booking from a Russian family, right? And so I thought it was an interesting case as well to just see, okay, is this now actually, are you allowed to actually do business with them, given the current sanctions?
Yeah.
Because normally as private people, we wouldn't think about that, but you could argue that indeed you should not be doing that because they're on a sanction list, or any kind of way.
That's an interesting topic, and we cannot really say, well, the question depends on the case as such, because EU sanctions, even though it's a very broad package of sanctions that is now being imposed, they are still tailor-made. So not everything that is Russian is sanctioned. So we can still do some, there are still certain interactions possible. Some people,
gas applies in any case, right? Yes.
Some people and entities are on the sanctions list, really, and then of course you cannot do any business with them. Their assets need to be frozen, and sort of you cannot do business with them. We will discuss a bit later. You can also not do indirect business with a sanctioned person or entity. So you really need to know sort of both the ownership control structure of, for example, an entity, and who's the ultimate beneficial owner, for example. But also if you have sort of like a trade or export chain where financing is provided, you really have to know where is this, for who is this intended, and where does it end up. So
Okay. Yeah, that's when it becomes tough, right?
That's when it becomes tough. Yeah. So maybe I'm sure, well, for parties active in the financial services area that are under supervision, for example, of the Dutch Central Bank or the AFM, there are specific requirements. So they have to have their sort of administrative organization in order and compliant, so that they are able to screen all their relations, and that goes further than just the client concept that we know from AML, anti-money laundering legislation. So you really need to know everyone that is involved within a transaction. As a bank, for example, you need to know who they are and whether or not they are on a sanctions list or not. And then what with the Russian sanctions, and actually the Russian sanctions have been in place since 2014. That's when they were first with the annexation of Crimea and Sevastopol. That's when the Russian sanctions were sort of imposed for the first time. We have sectoral sanctions in place, so really focusing on certain activities, so not so much individuals and entities. And then you also need to know what your as a financial services company, you need to know what your customers are actually doing, trading, what kind of financing you're providing, whether or not they're in that sector or not. So that's another additional challenge.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
And actually, the Dutch Central Bank and the AFM are currently sort of sending out letters to all their entities under their supervision, that they need to make sure that they are compliant with also these specific requirements, that they're doing their sanction screening, and that they're reporting any sanctions persons that they find in their sort of customer base. So that's. Okay.
Yeah, indeed, the heat is on. That's clear for sure.
Yeah. Shall we move on?
Sure.
Yeah. I briefly touched upon it, sort of the EU and US diversion. I do not want to add too much more, but it's good to know that US sanctions have a broad sort of reach, or an extraterritorial reach. So of course they are applicable to US persons, US entities, anyone working in the US. So if we would pick up our laptops and sort of take a plane to I don't know, LA, we would be covered by US sanctions, or when there's a US nexus. And that's an interesting point, because if transactions are taking place in US dollars, for example, you are covered by the US legislation and US sanctions legislation. So it's good to keep in mind, because a lot of business, of course, is happening is because US dollar transactions are moving through the US financial system, and then US finds that it has jurisdiction. Secondary sanctions are tricky. There is debate about secondary sanctions being applied here with respect to the Russia-Ukraine situation as well. Even when the US has no jurisdiction, because there are no US persons, there's no US nexus, some sanctions programs are so important to the US that even though that if you as a non-US person would do a certain business with Iran, North Korea, they feel themselves free to put you on a sort of a blacklist, and making your life in the US, if you would want to invest, a lot more difficult. So that's also where very much the international multinationals are very aware of.
Like you could argue that's a strong discouragement to act in a certain way.
And then the EU has sort of a countermeasure in that respect. For example, with respect to Cuba and Iran, they have an EU blocking statute. That means that they are, of course, you're free to decide whether or not you do business, or whether or not you decide not to do business with a certain country. But they say if you really stop doing business, for example, with Iran, merely because of the US secondary sanctions risk, you're prohibited from doing so under EU blocking statute.
So if I would try to summarize that simply, that would say it's like you're not allowed to do business with them, but you can't say it's us that told you so.
Right.
Yeah.
And when, for example, a couple of years ago, 2016, Iran sanctions were lifted following the nuclear deal, or at least lifted to a large extent. Then the Trump administration came in and stepped out of the deal. Then, for example, KLM had their airlines again, sort of the route to Tehran was going on, and then Trump stepped out of the deal, and KLM said for economic reasons we're closing our...
Exactly. Yeah, too little passengers. We're not going anymore.
That's the blocking.
Happens to coincidence with
very,
coincidence with
short press release. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
But that's sort of as a background, but it makes it, it's a political instrument. It's sometimes a very opportunistic instrument. Also, EU and US are both also looking after the interests of... Yeah. And that's also what you see with the Russian sanctions. Yes, we're trying to... they're trying to tackle the Russian economy as much as they can, but still being aware of EU business and sometimes EU subsidiaries of Russian entities are sometimes sort of exempted from the sanctions being applied. Yeah, that's so maybe in short, that we already briefly touched upon it. There are some general notions that always come back in the various sanctions regimes. Usually there's what we also see now, lots and hundreds of people and entities closely linked to the Putin administration and friends and allies and sort of the larger state-owned companies are all being listed. Their funds and economic resources are being frozen, or large yachts and ships are being sort of held in ports, etc. And also, so you their funds and economic resources are frozen, and you cannot make available funds and economic resources to these listed persons and entities, and that applies directly and indirectly. So that's what we said. If even though if a company is not sanctioned as such, but the owner, 50% or more owner of such a company is listed, then you're still indirectly dealing with a sanctioned person or entity, which is prohibited. And other sort of prohibitions we see on goods and services, well, making available economic resources is an important one, I would say, because actually it's not all about sending over money business, and you provide, if you or a Russian company that is indirectly by a sanctioned person, that can be considered making available economic resources, because through the marketing campaign, the company is able to generate more business, and that might then not be allowed. So it's really something to keep in mind. It's a very broad notion. And then, of course, there are all kinds of sales, exports, embargoes, of course, on arms, other military goods, dual-use goods. So those are in general can be used for both civil and military purposes. All kinds of technology, but then and also sort of the provision of service, be it technical assistance or be it financial assistance or lending related to those exports are prohibited as well. And another important one, and that comes back, and you really have to keep that in mind, that circumvention of sanctions is explicitly prohibited. So if you are in a certain...
Kind of makes sense.
Kind of makes sense, but still it comes up quickly, I would say. So if you are in a certain deal structure, And that's also a lot of warnings are being sort of handed out right now. If you're asked, for example, as a lawyer or a law firm, you get questions, can you please help us restructuring this deal? If it's now a Russian-related deal that it needs to be restructured, you really have to be mindful, why are we restructuring this? Is this because shares are being handed over from maybe a listed person to the brother or the sister that is not listed, and that way, or if currencies are being shifted.
No, exactly. All changes are suspect by default in the case.
Or we route through China maybe because China does not have the same sanctions as we have. You really need to be mindful there. So that's
for sure.
And I think this is when it comes to Russia and Ukraine, the sectoral sanctions prohibitions are probably the most tricky ones. Those relate to the military sector, the energy sector, so certain drilling or oil activities are being prohibited right now. Last week also, aircraft carriers, airlines, all kinds of space programs, aviation programs are being sanctioned. Seven Russian financial institutions have been cut off since this weekend from the international payment system SWIFT.
That has a very big impact, right? So I think just like to touch upon that a little bit, because I think it's been seen as also I think by Ursula von der Leyen called the nuclear option, as in the sense of basically economic warfare. So I think it's let's say the good thing about it is that indeed you basically you don't enforce it through other parties, right? You use SWIFT, of course, but it's very strict and very direct. But then again, also the side effects are enormous. And one of the things we, for example, see is that Russian people that happen to study in the Netherlands, for example, or that they suddenly also can't access their money anymore. So these are it's quite a heavy duty impact.
Absolutely.
But do you actually believe that does it have an effect actually as it is supposed to?
Well, that's a good question. Is it not the normal guy in the street that is being sort of or that really feels the implications hereof, and whether or not, of course, they're targeting as much as possible the circle around sort of the Russian administration, around Putin, around the Russian oligarchs that assist him or stand behind the government and the administration there. And the question is not whether do they really make use of the financial system in this way through these a couple of financial institutions, or is there are there monies and assets elsewhere all over the world in areas where we might not be able to touch them with these sanctions. That's really a question, and I think a big concern for everyone. And also, yes, there are large banks on this SWIFT prohibition, but for example, one of the largest is Sberbank. There are sanctions against Sberbank, but not the SWIFT sanction yet. So there are certain banks are still are still being are able to make use of
and I think that it largely has to do with the dependency on energy supplies, right? Where I think Europe wants to keep on paying the bill for the gas to avoid it stop from flowing.
So that and maybe I put it in a little bit of an abstract picture. We discussed it a little bit, the direct and indirect sanctions obligations. So you need to know if you're, you can be the client or you can be the bank or another financial services company. If you're providing certain funding for an export, you need to know in the end where that export is going, what is it used for. You want to know sort of who is in the ownership and control structure, and it's not just ownership as in terms of shares, but control is very much also a factual assessment of how dominant a person's influence is in a company, and in looking at your own structure and your headquarters, etc. May be useful and needed if you have a US headquarters, for example. Also US sanctions apply, or maybe Canada, Japan also have their sanctions, so it's also good to keep that in mind, sort of where in which structure you are. And also there's also a certain responsibility. That's also what the EU requires from its companies established here, that if you have subsidiaries elsewhere, that you also inform them of the EU sanctions, what they entail, and that they are aware that they need to keep those in mind as well. So, yeah, and this is, I think, right now what a lot of companies are struggling with, to get this a clear picture of their clients and what they're doing. And
maybe one thing I'd like to highlight here is that, because here you specifically have the word bank in the center of it. Well, of course, we also see that other organizations are also similarly hit, as in payment institutions, for example, asset managers potentially. There's quite a wide range actually of activities, financial activities that are being hit here, right? I'm not sure if you get to that later. I see you skip forward in slides, so otherwise I'll wait a little bit. But just good to, I'm interested in any case to also see, because very often I tend to see also that when policymakers think about the financial industry, they think about the banks and not about the 10,000 other parties that are actually part of the same ecosystem.
No, absolutely, because we can skip a little bit forward to the sort of in very high level picture of the sanction packages against Ukraine in relation to Ukraine and Russia. When we look at the financial sector, for example, it's loans and credits and all kinds of sort of financial assistance being provided. That is where sanctions are being imposed. Capital markets in terms of whether or not transferable securities can be bought, traded, etc. Those include, and that's something that the EU and also the G7 have sort of confirmed. These include crypto assets. So crypto assets are both from the capital markets sectoral sanctions relevant, but also from a perspective when you look at making available economic resources, or when you need to freeze certain funds of listed persons and entities. Of course, crypto comes into play as well.
We see that moving forward a lot, right? So also there, I think there's some discussion about, for example, the recent decision by the Biden administration to actually look again at the crypto regulation from a more federal point, which I think you should also see partly into this light, right?
Absolutely. Also, in the Netherlands, of course, they're not under sort of the financial supervision regulation umbrella yet, but under the anti-money laundering legislation. But also the crypto service providers here need to do their CBD checks, etc. But also the previous the specific sanctions regulation and additional gatekeeper function also applies to them, for example, here. So they need to do their sanction screening, and freeze any crypto assets of listed or indirectly listed persons and entities. So big challenge there. And then, yeah, and the Russian bank SWIFT system is on there. Shares in euro cannot be traded as of mid-April, if I'm not mistaken. And that goes for every Russian. So that's a very large or broad sanction. Yeah, and everything, also the other sectors are relevant, even if you're servicing one of these sectors from a financial perspective or payment services or whatsoever, you need to be mindful, because also the assistance to those sectors can be a problem.
Yep. Yeah, for sure.
So you need to know, well, who am I dealing with, but also do I have, if you're very active in a certain sector, it's good to sort of also look at it from that perspective.
Yep.
Yeah. And then, all the persons and entities that are being added to the list. And I think, every other day, more people and more entities are added to those sanctions lists. So that's something to really keep an eye on.
Yeah. One thing also interesting in this case, well, this is actually EU based, right? So I think so, but a lot of let's say global, or let's say more that should have much more international impact. You see that, for example, China says, we don't participate. It's quite interesting actually how, because they basically say we it's nice that you want us not to do business with them, but we ignore this request. That's also, I think, quite a statement in that sense that's being made, and I'm not sure most smaller countries probably wouldn't be able to make such a statement, but I think China is taking the world stage here as well to say, we'll determine whether there will be sanctions or not.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that's indeed where here EU, US are sort of taking the lead. But it's good to be, if you're, for example, in a transaction with China, China not applying the same sanctions as the EU or the US do. If you're, for example, in a contract, you would want to make sure that they, for that transaction, comply with your EU legislation, for example, to make sure that they are not after you've done your business with them, that they are exporting again to Russia, because then you would indirectly.
Is that an obligation also? So should you be wary of doing business with China if you could suspect that it leads to business with Russia?
Yeah, I would say yes. So if we.
So you take your time.
No, but it's always good, and that's also what the government is expecting from you, is that you do that you know who you're dealing with when you're doing a transaction, so that you know the parties in your chain, and especially now, I think some neighboring countries from sanctioned countries. You need to be mindful of, in this case, that I think China is one of them, especially because they take this stance in other, when it comes to Iran or etc. It's sometimes being mindful of Dubai or whatsoever. In the beginning, when the Russian sanctions were not as severe as they are now, business with Crimea was very much sanctioned, so you needed to be mindful that if you were exporting to Russia, that doing an export that was allowed, that they would not sort of
go through Crimea. Okay.
Yeah. So that is something to be mindful of, and of course, you cannot always know everything for sure. But if you've done your checks, if you've done your screening, if you have sort of laid down in your contract, please, for this transaction, I want you to comply with the sanctions I need to comply with. Yeah.
But I think that this is an interesting topic, because I think this is also what we see in the anti-money laundering discussion, is you should do it good enough, right? But that very much tends to lead to a redundance of checklists and procedural approach towards it, very often without result, because it becomes very procedural and good enough. What kind of standard is that exactly, and are we what are the results of that? I think that's one of the big challenges we see here as well, right? Because and that's also one of the, if you look at how AML has looked, I think everyone has fear, especially around fines that could be issued for this.
Absolutely.
But how could you actually prevent that properly as a firm?
Yeah. Well, I think I'm skipping one slide back, and indeed, it's a risk-based approach that you're required to take, and that's of course then you often do not know yet what that entails, but it does. You need to take certain measures that sort of fit to your company and your company size and the type of business that you're doing, and also the type of whether or not it's a risky business that you're in when it comes to sanctions. If you're indeed, for example, active or providing services or payment services or financing to very much focused on the energy sector, that is higher risk, I would say here, and something that you need to be mindful of. If it's really retail business, can be different, although also things are changing there now. But I think what authorities are requiring is that you do take some measures, that you know what you're dealing with, that you've done some form of risk assessment, that people in your company are sort of aware of what's going on. I think you cannot cover everything, but sometimes it's also, if you do not want to look because you're afraid of what you will find, then you already know that you might want to. Yeah,
you have to. Yes.
So
very human approach.
Yeah,
right?
But it happens a lot, and there's no one size fits all. But yeah, you do want to know a little bit about your customers and where your products are ending up, and sometimes what's also in some sectors already very customary is asking an end user statement, for example, from the person that you're dealing with. That might be good. Yeah, those are, of course, you cannot. There are always ways. People will always find a way around things, but if you've sort of covered your bases, and I think, that is the best starting point, I would say. And not getting information when you're asking for it, that's also, I would say, a red flag. And really being mindful of the risks you run.
Exactly. No, definitely. That's quite a challenge, and so I think that's it's good that I think you mentioned this. That this is how parties are actually looking at it. So By the way, I just also want to highlight to the people we have listening in to ask any questions that they have. So you could also raise your hand and ask the question in person through the camera, or type it in the chat, whatever you prefer.
Yeah. I've skipped back and forth. Yeah, maybe good to know is that there are, as an addition, where am I going? Oh yeah, there are always some exemptions when it comes to sanctions. Yes, this is an instrument in absolutely the crisis situation that Ukraine is in, a political instrument, but sometimes they're opportunistic exemptions, as we talked about, but also in terms of humanitarian aid, medical assistance. There are all kinds of exemptions, sometimes also for existing contracts that were in place before the sanctions were being imposed. Sometimes you can get an authorization through the authorities so that you can still continue delivering for something that you've agreed on prior to the sanctions being imposed. And that's especially also in the COVID situation, a lot of additional exemptions were made, and then also the EU sort of really emphasized to be cautious of over compliance. Sometimes it's also for certain financial institutions looking at the small exemptions to these sanctions regulations can entail so much work, etc., that they're commercially hardly viable, so to say, or feasible, and but still important to be able to get those medical equipments over.
But because I think, let's say in general, sanctions are not economically viable because you're not getting paid to not do business.
Absolutely, yeah.
But of course, at some point, indeed, the costs are just going through the roof, and that would just makes it just not feasible to do it.
Yeah.
Do you see that also regulators and policymakers actually have an eye for that, and are they willing to go in dialogue to actually assess that on a continuous basis?
Yeah.
Or is that still tough? And is it just expected that this is just being done?
Yeah, I think right now, well, my perspective is a little bit that this is expected, that it's being done. On the other hand, I think we're all in this situation, and yes, it's a political instrument. The EU, the Dutch government say, okay, we find this really important, we're going to impose these sanctions. But in the end, it's of course everyone, and especially all companies doing international business, and everyone active in the financial area, that needs to make sure that this actually works and is actually being implemented. So yeah, the burden is on all of us, I would say. And that's a challenge, and I think yes, they are warning, and also the regulators are warning everyone. Please make sure that you're aware of the sanctions, that you're doing your screenings, etc. On the other hand, I'm not sure what will happen here. When I look at our day-to-day practice and also the fines from the regulators that are being imposed, those are often, those fines are being imposed often because of certain files, certain client files where these checks, etc., went wrong. And I think having been worked in Washington, D.C. for a while, where you see the US regulator, they also really look at sort of the systematic failures. In the past, I think first international bank that was got a large fine for sanctions violations, that was ABN AMRO at the time, 2005. And that was really something, systematic failure of sanction screenings. Same with ING at the time, they got a fine for 619 million. And sort of they really look at the systematic failure and whether or not sort of senior management was aware. That's also where it went wrong with BNP Paribas at the time, 8.9 billion US dollar fine. But they were actually, even the compliance department had already sort of noticed the compliance failure when it came to sanctions. But top management had just sort of put the report and said thank you and put it in a drawer. Even when they were investigating, transactions were still going out the door. So so they are really looking at the systematic failure here. I sometimes feel that we're looking at specific files, case files, or they do a spot check and so we'll have to see how this is going to play out.
Yeah, I think it's it remains very interesting. I think because I think that we've yet to discover how actually the role between the political side and the business side, how they actually should come together in a proper way, right? So I think it's currently being enforced, but that it means that the one that has to do it isn't really playing along. They just do the bare minimum unless you actually threaten them with a very big hit with a fine. And the question is if you're actually just making the most out of the potential of the capabilities that you have and the intentions that you have if you put them together.
Right.
So I think that the governance of that is something that I hope also as well that in the future they will look at how this could work, because in collaboration it could be much stronger, I think, than it currently is.
Right. Yeah, and I think this is something that it's on all of us So yeah, why not work together on it? Yeah, and it's challenging and it brings dilemmas because I think because it's such a political instrument, and you also see the downsides of it, like you mentioned, students not being able to access accounts anymore. Discussions on internet being there's some media companies that are being shut off from broadcasting, but also from internet access. Whether or not people also say yes, but maybe that way we can get some objective information out there anyway. So here and there are dilemmas on how to deal with these sanctions and whether or not you can stand behind those at all times. That's
Yeah, no, exactly. I think that's and I think that a dialogue is just very much required here going forward to make sure it keeps on working. So we'll definitely also try to set up a session with for example, the central bank to also have a discussion about how the sanctions are being implemented and what's next to rule out any friction if possible. One example, I think you just mentioned as well, for example, the Russian citizens that are in the Netherlands, for example, and cannot access their bank accounts anymore. We've also seen, for example, the Dutch neobank stepping up and saying like, oh, well, we'll give them a new bank account to make sure that at least they are able to buy groceries. Well, I think you could argue that that's part of the humanitarian help you could offer that under that flag. But it might also be a challenge. It might also be scrutinized from a political standpoint. How do you see how should we look at that? And is that something you need to be careful with in any case if you take such action?
Yeah, well, I think when you look at, for example, media coverage also on all these sanctions being imposed, I think in the beginning a general feeling was sometimes also a bit difficult to get a grasp on all the sanctions regulations because every day there's an amendment to the sanction and another amendment. And in the beginning, the feeling was everything Russia related is prohibited. That is, yes, a lot is prohibited, but not everything. So if you, when opening or inviting someone to open a bank account, if you you run your normal checks for such person, you do want to make sure that this person is not listed or indirectly listed on the sanctions list. You should be able to provide certain services. On the other hand, also a lot of companies in the beginning have said, we're going to shut down all our Russian-related business. That's also quite a challenging point of view because, yes, the sanctions regulations require you to stop certain certain dealings with certain Russian sectors or certain Russian companies or certain Russian persons. But not everything. So, yes, if you have an ongoing contract, for example, you are, the sanctions regulations say that if you do not comply do not perform under your contract for reasons, for proper reasons of sanctions regulations, you're free and good to do that. But if you use that in, well, not the right manner, and you just stop performing under a contract, even though the sanctions regulations do not actually prohibit that, your counterpart may just go to court here and say this is a wrongful non-performance, and then so you do run.
No, exactly. So that's the other side risk.
There.
Exactly. The performance under your existing contracts cannot be thrown overboard just because of the sanctions, just like that.
Yeah,
but that's probably had to do with the fact that also the government doesn't want to step in to refund any losses that are occurring with these kind of transactions, right? So I think that's
Yeah.
why they would say, you just have to comply with your normal legal duty outside of the sanctions.
Yeah. And also the sanctions regulations explicitly say that such contracting counterparts are free to go to court here and are also free to get certain legal assistance and actually pay for such legal assistance. There are exemptions there to get that in place. So that is something to be mindful of, and now I think a lot of larger companies say, okay, yes, we continue with our contracting or our existing contracts, but not do any new business. So it's more nuanced. Yeah.
Okay. I think one because I think we're closing in on 10:30. So just what you mentioned is like you have some tools you think that could be useful for people. So I thought it would be good to spend some time on that, and hopefully then also you just mentioned as well sort of the rapid pace in which amendments and new sanctions are being imposed.
Yeah.
To also maybe give an idea on how it's easy for people to keep track of that.
Yeah.
Okay. Hope it still fits in time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we did put some of these tools that we use in the slides. We can share these if you like, and
yes,
they are maybe already being shared. Of course, what we use, I think, maybe to start is that EU, OFAC in the US, also UK is also good to be mindful of, because with the UK no longer being in the European Union, they have their own sanctions lists. But they are these EU Council, etc. They send out news alerts every day, also on the new sanctions being imposed. Often it does take 1 or 2 days, maybe, before the sanctions that are announced or agreed upon are actually laid down in the proper regulation and sort of published on in the official journal. But there are always useful links through those news alerts. As lawyers, we like to have the complete picture. Like I said, the Russia sanctions exist since 2014. So all the additions that we've seen since 23 February are sort of imposed through amendments to that initial regulation. There's not a consolidated version yet where everything is combined. So that's really something to keep in mind at this moment. You really have to look at all the different, for internal use, we are sort of gathering that everything together, but it's there's no consolidated version yet, but should be there hopefully any day now. That is something that is useful. So we've put the numbers and names of the regulations, the most important ones, at least here in the slide. So for the sectoral sanctions, those are all combined in that regulation 833 2014. So there's the 2014 again, and then all the amendments to it. Persons and entities are all in the 2969 2014 regulation, and those are also being amended as we speak. Good to know is that for Crimea and Sevastopol, and now also Luhansk and Donetsk, there are really sanctions against everything that's going on in those areas.
Okay.
Good to keep in mind. Belarus already had some restrictions, but has additional restrictions right now because they are being seen as supporting the Russian Federation's administration. And then here are the most important. Of course, there are lists of other countries as well, but sort of the combined lists of persons, entities, and other assets that are being sanctioned. And it's not just, it's usually persons, entities, but it can also be ports. Some ports are on the sanctioned list. Some ships are sanctioned. Those can all be found here. And also the EU has a what they call sanctioned map. And you can type in a name and it will tell you.
And do you have, is there like machine readable information available about sanctions? Because, for example, around, if you talk about persons, I could also imagine that it would actually be very interesting if you would actually have a full database rather than on paper, a list that you could actually use in your systems.
Yeah. So these are sort of databases online, but you still have to type in. There are various parties, third-party vendors that provide systems, that sort of software that integrates with your CRM systems and that do checks. That can be some use World Check, Bloomberg. There are all kinds of useful tools that where you can actually sort of do an automatic screening of your client base, maybe on a day-to-day basis even. Yeah. So that's absolutely, and and if you want to know now, like, oh, I'm looking at this new deal. Let's see who they are, and if.
Yeah, then this is very useful to start with.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Any other tips that you may have around this for parties to be able to comply with these sanctions, or any topics that you feel that should be discussed?
Yeah, I think we've discussed a lot already.
For sure.
I think I do keep in mind sort of compliance and contractual safeguards when it comes to risk management, I would say. And then reputation is another one. Maybe I'm not sure. And that's, I think, also a difficult one.
I think it's increasingly seen as a method of policymakers to actually enforce certain regulations, because the threat of ruining someone's reputation.
Yeah, well, yeah, we've seen it with Shell on the one hand, sort of stopping certain cooperations and joint ventures, and on the other hand, then by publicly buying new oil, etc. That has cost them, at least in terms of reputation, I think a lot. But that is, I think,
I find it interesting while we basically keep the gas flowing. It's a really interesting debate to have on how you should look at that. But indeed, it was kind of silly in the way that they had this statement of pulling back and very soon thereafter doing this trade.
And in a way, you can understand sort of the difficult situation that everyone is in and the dilemmas everyone is dealing with. But it's also from a reputational point of view, something to be mindful of.
Yeah, for sure.
I think really creating sufficient awareness within your organization that sort of everyone has some knowledge on the topic and is able to at least to have some feelers out when you're in new business, what to be mindful of. I think that is already sort of what questions do I need to ask? What do I need to keep in mind when doing international business? I think that is an important one. I think it all starts there, and so it's not just a responsibility of senior management or compliance or legal, but I think it's for everyone in the business. It's useful to at least know a little bit of, be aware of things.
No, exactly. So internal awareness about this and discussions about how to do it are very much advised.
And there's not always a black and white answer also in these situations. And maybe also think about, and of course now we're right in the middle of everything. We talked about contracts and making sure also there you have some safeguards in it to that compliance with at least your sanctions regulations is arranged for. But also thinking about, okay, what if new sanctions are being imposed? Because can I get out of certain
contracts? Yeah, because some things might become difficult.
And also from a commercial perspective, sometimes you may not be able to get your money back in, also given also the financial sanctions there. So that's something to be mindful of, and also when entering into new contracts, even though you can, and you might be allowed, think about what to do if you would need to get out at a certain point, or if certain assets would be frozen.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then we're now talking about all the EU regulations and the sanctions that the EU is imposing towards Russia. But of course, they're also from their side, so to say, they are looking at sanctions and
towards European firms.
Restrictions.
And, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So that's
also good to keep that in mind. Yeah. If you want to do business in Russia again.
Yeah.
That's of course one of the questions to ask there. I think.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, thanks, Simone. I think it's a really clear story. I think it's I'm really happy that we have had this discussion to just touch base a little bit on sort of the developments in sanctions and how you could look at that from a financial services perspective. So thank you very much for sharing your insights and joining me here on this morning.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, happy to do so. So we'll share the slides later on the Holland Fintech member portal to make sure that they're available. We'll also share the video here that you could actually listen it all back. At the same time, I'd like to also remind you that we have a article about how you could support Ukraine because they still in need for a lot of support. So I'd love to flag that as well, that we've listed a lot of the initiatives that are available to donate, to support, to help them with business. So I definitely urge you to have a look at that and see the most we can do. And at the same time, let's hope, in any case, fingers crossed for a soon end of the war and all the hostilities. So thank you for joining, and thank you very much. See you next time, very soon, I hope. Cheers.
Bye-bye.